Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. My guest on this episode of Writers at Work is Alex Segura, whose seemingly overnight success is anything but. Long before his 2022 novel Secret Identity was named an NPR Best Mystery of the Year, a New York Times Editor's Choice, and a winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, Alex had already developed a reputation as an author in two fields. He had written 5 crime novels set in Miami and a Star Wars adventure for young adult readers, and was established as a graphic novelist with his contributions to the ongoing sagas of Archie and the Riverdale Gang, Spider-Man, and now Dick Tracy. He's represented in the anthology Spider-Man Stories from the Spider-Verse out in October, and unless he squeezes another one in before then, his next novel, Alter Ego, will arrive in December. Alex Segura, welcome to Writers at Work.
Thanks for having me.
I'm exhausted from just reading your introduction. I was going to say busy, but I don't know any successful writers who aren't juggling many projects. Do you find that to be the case?
I think it's more a byproduct of the industry. I think now publishing, you almost have to stay a few steps ahead of it so you don't get pigeonholed. My thought is, if I do enough different things well, that when things come around and maybe one of the things I do falls out of fashion, I can always do something else. It sounds very pragmatic, and it's not really that strategic. I think it's really what I'm interested in, a lot of different things, whether it's comics or novels or audio or what have you. So it's really finding ways to tap into what I'm interested in, but also not just do the same greatest hits over and over again. But yeah, I do think the most successful writers are very busy because they've turned this thing that for most of us starts out as a side hustle that we hope will become something bigger. They've turned it into that bigger thing.
Now, you and I first met when you were working for Archie Comics
hmm
in Westchester County, New York. When did you begin at the company, and how did that job come about?
I started at Archie. I had worked at DC Comics before in Manhattan, and that was my first job full time in publishing, in comics publishing. I'd worked in other places in kind of related to comics before, but I started at Archie in 2009, and I was there until 2013, and then I briefly went back to DC Comics again for a couple years before they moved to LA, and then I hopped back to Archie, where I was there until, I want to say, until about 2020 or so.
Um, to quote Secret Identity, working in comics was the dream that brought 28-year-old Carmen to New York from Miami. Was that you, Alex, leaving Miami to pursue a dream in comics?
I mean, you write what you know, so I definitely knew what it felt like to leave Miami and work in comics. I think there's pieces of me in Carmen, just like there's pieces of me in every character I write, whether they're a hero or a villain or the protagonist or a supporting cast member. I think that's kind of like the secret sauce. Everyone wants to say, "Oh, are you Pete?" or "Are you this person?" or I'm sure you get it too. Are you this character in your novel? But we kind of carve off little pieces of ourselves to give life to these characters. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a very relatable touchstone for me and Carmen.
Uh, so did you have a natural feel for writing comics? I mean, what is the particular skill set, and when did you realize that you had it?
I think the desire came up before the natural skill set. I loved comics as a kid. I still do. I mean, but I was really obsessed with the characters and the world and their powers and how they interacted with each other. And obviously, it wasn't just superhero comics. I loved Archie comics growing up that was my doorway into comics. Um, I love the blend of visual and text. This idea of reading and seeing the pictures simultaneously really spoke to me as a kid who likes stories, but who also, I'm not an artist. I mean, I'm not an artist, professional artist, but I still kind of doodle and draw, and I always did as a kid, and I thought that's where my path was going. So it felt like a great synergy of those things. But that was, the passion came before the craft, and so I found it really hard because it's so different from writing prose, where it's so much more of a collaborative medium. You really have to be willing to put your words on paper and let the artist do their thing. It's much more like a film or being in a band where, as long as everyone's doing what they're supposed to do well, it'll come out okay. But if somebody isn't giving it their all, it might not be as great. And I think the challenge that a lot of prose writers have going back into comics or writing comics is that lack of control, but also it's almost algorithmic in how you can write. You can fit so many words in a sentence, so many sentences in a balloon. You can have so many balloons in a panel. You can have so many panels on a page, and you get so many pages in a comic. Not all comics are the same. Obviously, you can write a comic, or you can write a graphic novel, or you can write a series of graphic novels. But there is that kind of tenet that you this is all you can do to fill certain spaces. And as prose writers, we don't have those limitations when we write novels. You can spend 10 pages on describing the dinner table setting. Should we do that? Does that make good narrative? Probably not. But the constrictions of comics, and then also the realization that a lot of your description and literal words are not going to make it on the page. Like, you could spend paragraphs and paragraphs describing a scene for the artist. None of that goes on the page because it's being translated through the prism of the artist. And all that you get on the page actually is the dialogue and the sound effects. So it's that ability. You have to let go. You have to be willing to let go. You have to want to collaborate. I mean, I always ask artists before I work with them, like, what do you hate to draw? Like, what is the one thing you cannot stand drawing? A lot of times artists don't like drawing horses, they don't like drawing cars, they don't like drawing certain things. And more importantly, what do you like to draw? Like, what are the characters you want to draw? What are the scenes that really get you excited to kind of come to your drawing table? Because at that point you're writing for an audience of one. If you get the artist excited, they're going to be excited as they work, and then that energy will hopefully pass on to the colorist and to the letterer and then to the editor and to the reader, ideally. Whereas with novels, you just write it. You write it, and you're writing for yourself. You're the audience of one, and then you hope that somebody else will like it. So I think that's the craft challenge, is putting your ego aside and being more of a team player. And also, sometimes you see the art come in and it's not what you visualized in your head as you were writing the script, and you have to be okay with that. 9 times out of 10, it's better than what you visualize because they're artists. They're thinking about it differently, which is why I try not to over direct an artist with description. Alan Moore, who wrote Watchmen and V for Vendetta, like, his scripts are notoriously long and hyper detailed, and you can do that if you're Alan Moore, but I think a lot of the time you should rely on the abilities of your artist. And I'll say something like medium shot or close up or overhead view. Like, I know basic camera angles and I know basically what I want the panel to look like. But I always say, if you have a better way of doing this or a cooler way of doing this, then please do that, because we're both going to look great. It'll be fine. So I hope that answered your question.
It does, uh, in fact, it stimulates another one. Now
Mhm.
you're in this collaborative environment, and yet at the same time you're writing the Pete Fernandez mysteries. Do I have that timeline right?
Yeah, the Pete's Mist novels started around the same time I was starting in comics, writing in comics.
So how was it to move between the two forms? Did you do it fluidly? Or did you have to stop and take a few minutes rest to get your head into a different type of writing?
It was almost served as like a palate cleanser, and it still does to this day. Like, I tend to be better at writing the comic stuff during the day, and the novel stuff flows more quickly at night
Um,
because I don't know. Yeah, it's not a hard and fast rule, but I mean, the comic stuff, like I was saying before, is okay. I need to revise this, or I need to break down the script. I have this very loose paragraph idea for the script. Let me break it up into pages. Let me break up each page into dialogue. Let me then add the descriptions for break up the dialogue into panels, add the description. It's very, it builds on itself. Whereas with
right.
prose, I do outline, which is a lesson I learned on my journey. Like, midway through Silent City, I was like, I have no idea where this is going. Um, and it would be a lot better if I had a roadmap. And so I re-outlined the book and then had to rewrite the book. But since, and then, it wasn't until I wrote a Star Wars novel that I realized I need to outline tightly, which is to say, literally break up by chapters and give myself the broad strokes which then allows you to detour. But my point is, I have a rough outline, and then I can kind of crank. I can sit there and say, okay, I'm going to sit and write like a couple thousand words tonight, and I know what the highway signs are saying and where I need to go. But if I find something interesting, I can kind of detour into that with the knowledge that eventually I have to pull back onto the expressway and keep going.
So Silent City comes out in 2013, right?
Hmm.
Uh, how long did you work on it beforehand? You sort of alluded to this a minute ago, but did it flow, or was it fits and starts?
It did not flow. It was very hard. I mean, and I think every novel is equally hard, just in different ways. I think Silent City, it was the question of, can I do this? Like, I want to do this. Am I good enough to do this? And I'd been reading so many great crime novels around that. I think it was around the time I started putting pen to paper on Silent City was probably, I want to say 2008,
Mm,
2009. And that was just, pecking at it, like thinking, well, who are the characters? And at that point I'd been a fan. I was already a fan of the medium. I would go to BoucherCon. I was in the community as a fan and a reader. And I really was drawn into these books. Obviously the high notes like Chandler and the Lou Archer books, Ross McDonald, and all the classics. And then I was really pulled into more modern stuff that was very steeped in setting, like the George Pelicanos, the Nick Stefanos books, Laura Lippman's Baltimore books, Dennis Lehane's Pat and Angie books, and obviously and the Michael Connolly Bosch stuff. Um, all of that felt very fresh because the heroes were flawed and messed up and made mistakes and were not perfect. They weren't these kind of tainted knights. Like, Marlowe's great, but you don't really get much of a sense of Marlowe as the
mm,
person, which is kind of part of the charm. You're there for the prose and the vibe. Um, but I really like these characters, and kind of in I guess spike of ego, I thought, well, I can do this for Miami. Like, I was also feeling really homesick. I had just moved to New York, and New York is hard. It's hard to kind of pivot from somewhere else to New York. It's just all consuming, and it can be a lonely place. It's full of people, but you can also feel like disconnected from all these people that you're seeing on the subway or in the city or what have you. I think that's changed a little bit as the city's evolved. But my point being is that I thought, okay, let me try to do this, but I didn't know how to do it. I'd read books about it, and I was trying to follow, like, I think James Hall wrote a really great book on how to write thrillers. Obviously, Stephen King had Into Writing, which is fantastic, and Larry Block has a lot of great books on writing. But for whatever reason, what really got me going was reading books, reading the novels, and just seeing
right,
what do I
right,
like, and
right.
how does this author do it? And I don't want to say aping them, but really like just trying to see how they did it and try to do it myself. And that took a while, and it took a lot of revising, because you're not only writing the book, you're figuring out your own process and
Mm,
as you do it. So I was like, am I a daytime writer? Am I, so I had to really kind of pare down any distractions, and I still have to do that to this day. Like, what's the fastest way to get to the work? And it's hard because I think there's so many distractions, especially now, whether it's social media, whether it's email, or just literally, I have two young kids, so a lot of times family can be demanding, which is fine, like that's good. But you have, what's the fastest way to the work? And
yeah,
that's what that first novel was, like, learning how to get to the work. Like, I could read a million books about writing a novel, and I think I kind of fell into that rabbit hole. Like, I'm going to read all these books, and I'm going to read Patricia Highsmith's book about writing novels. I'm going to read this one and that one, and they're all good, but I don't find myself going back to them. I find myself going back to work. I find myself going back to books I really liked and turns of phrases I really admire, um and just, if I find myself kind of vamping or like overthinking stuff, then that tells me that I'm not working, that I'm just kind of, or I can, it's the challenge of research too. Like, you can research until you do nothing else. Like, you could just keep researching and researching, and there's no end to research. So I think it's being mindful of when you've gotten enough. As fiction writers, we want it to be accurate, and we want it to feel in world, but it's not an academic paper. So
right.
those are the things that I try to, like, be mindful of. Like, am I being true to my work ethic? Like, am I kind of dawdling? Am I like just doing these things to not do the work? And it's an ever it's an ongoing struggle, I think, for a lot of writers. So Silent City was hard because I had none of the experience. Now I can say, okay, well, now I'm just like, I've fallen into a Wikipedia like pit. So let me just pull myself out and just get back to the writing and just leave a note for myself to find it later, like to future Alex, who will have time to do this like very minuscule research, because what matters is the words. Like, did I get 20,000 words? Not 20,000, but did I get a chunk of
I
words
get you.
today, or did I spend like 3 hours figuring out what kind of gun this criminal was holding?
Right. Very early on in my career, I learned a valuable lesson, and that was that nobody has enough time to write a novel.
Yeah,
That
it's true.
and you have to sort of fight through that idea that there's some idealized period in the day that's precious and only for writing your books. And once you realize that it's always catch as catch can, and you start having to struggle to find 45 minutes or 2 hours or whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. No, one thing I tell younger writers, and it's still kind of amazing for me to say that because I still feel like I'm the younger writer. I'm still like the new guy. But one thing I always say is deceremonialize the process. Like a lot of writers, the sun has to be going through the window at a certain way, and they need certain candles, and music has to be playing, and they have to be in a certain room. And I'm not minimizing anyone's preferences. Like, it's great to have things that make you feel comfortable and ready to be creative, but I would say that the fewer steps you put between you and getting to the work, the quicker you're going to work. And so for me, like with two kids, lots of other projects kind of spinning at different speeds, I need to just be able to open my laptop at any time. Like, oh, they've just gone to bed, or oh, they're at camp today. Like, I can like sit and crank for 45 minutes and get the work done, because if I don't have that ability to switch it on and off, like I wouldn't get anything done, because all that ramp up and ramp down time, that's words you're losing.
right, right. You made me remember a book that I found very influential for my own writing, and I wonder if you know this book. It's called Understanding Comics
Oh
by
yeah.
How great is that book?
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's funny. I was at Comic Con over the weekend, and Scott McCloud was there, and I saw him like walking down, and I had to like interrupt him. I felt bad because I interrupted him listening to something, but it's a huge, and he was very gracious, I should say, but it was super important book just to understand the language of the medium and how the words and the pictures play off each other, like what it means to, how do you really build off the drama of like a page turn. Like, a lot of people, like when you're reading the comic, you don't think about it, but you should think about it when you're creating the comic, like the impact of like the image when you turn the page. You're using the medium's tools to create the drama, or things like that. That's maybe not the best
Right.
example, but using the structure of the comic to work for your story.
Yeah, I remember I didn't have any desire to become a comic writer, uh, a comic book writer, but I remember how excellent he was on three-act structure,
Yeah.
and that it automatically translated to other forms. Um, oh, I'm so glad you recommend that book.
Yeah, I mean, I handed it to my brother-in-law's a children's book illustrator and author, and he's kind of pivoted into graphic novels a little bit. And one of the things I told him, I was like, you need to read these. Like, it's because it's the trilogy of Understanding Comics and two other sequels. And so I think it's an invaluable thing, and you don't have to be an artist to pull from it. I think it's really
Yeah,
useful to writers because it explains to you what your artist is kind of thinking about.
yeah, I love that book.
Yeah.
So I'm just was reviewing your bio, and it seems to me that 2021 was a tumultuous year for you. The year before, you had concluded the Pete Fernandez series.
Uh-huh.
You won the Anthony Award for one of your short stories. You published the Star Wars novels. You were wearing a lot of hats at that time, Alex, and yet you went ahead with Secret Identity.
Yeah.
That's madness.
um yeah, I mean, I felt like the Pete books had reached at least their conclusion at the time. It's funny because I didn't think anything of it when I told my publisher, I was like, this is the last one. Polis Books at the time. Um and I didn't think anyone would really care. Like, I mean, I knew there were readers, obviously, and the last three Pete books had been nominated for Anthony's, and so there was some affection for the series, but I wasn't expecting the response, like emails and from other creators, like Ian Rankin messaged me and was like, "What are you doing? Like, why would you end this series? It's like people really like it," and that was really flattering. But I also realized that if I didn't end it, it ran the risk of becoming just episodic. And I needed time to at least think about, well, what would the series be in a different way? Because Pete's arc of recovery and his arc of becoming the detective had ended. It ended at the end of Miami Midnight. So, yeah, it was a big turning point year. And Secret Identity I'd originally envisioned as a standalone, but as you know, that's another story. You know, much later I figured out with while talking to my editor that there was another beat to the story, but I really wanted to pivot into not writing a series
Right.
because I wanted to, there's the marketing thought, like I want to appeal to more people, but I also wanted to tell different kinds of stories that weren't necessarily in the bucket of like a PI novel or a police procedural, or I wanted to just do something else. And I'd had the idea for Secret Identity in its most basic form for years. Like I remember reading Cavalier and Clay in college
Mm,
and just being fascinated. I love the book. It felt like it spoke to me because it was a literary novel about the comic book industry in the golden age. But my big takeaway from it, just as a fan, was, I really wish I could have read the Escapist comics, which is the character in Cavalier and Clay that Cavalier and Clay create, the Escapist. And I really remember thinking, like, well, it would have been cool if the comic pages were in the novel. Like, wouldn't
right.
that have been neat? I didn't think that 20 years later, Secret Identity would do that.
Would do
But
it.
yeah, but I mean, I had this idea. I knew I wanted to do it. I'd just done this Star Wars novel, which I felt like kind of raised my profile in terms of like readers. When you write a Star Wars book, you're definitely getting your work in front of so many more people. So it felt like the next thing couldn't be Pete Six. Not because I
Right.
didn't want
Right.
to. I mean, I didn't want to be honest. Like I didn't have an idea. That's also a big reason to end a series if you've just run out of ideas at the moment. Like, do I have ideas for Pete stuff now? Sure. Am I going to do one right away? I don't know. Like, it really depends on how things play. But um, Secret Identity came to me at the right time, and it felt like the right book at the moment. And I think it was kind of proven right in retrospect. But I wasn't thinking like strategically in terms of sales or things like that. It was also the book I was obsessing over, and I think that's something that is often underestimated. You should write the things that are getting you jazzed, because if you treat everything like an assignment, or if you treat it like something where you're chasing a trend, I hear a lot of writers say that. And it's, if it works for you, great. But a lot of writers say, well, this is the hot thing now, so I'm going to start writing this kind of book. And honestly, like if you start writing to a trend now, by the time your book comes out, the trend is gone.
Yeah. To me,
And
it's like being in a cover band.
yeah,
Who wants to be in a cover band?
yeah. I mean, I'll tell you, when I wrote the first Pete book, everyone told me the PI novel was dead. And I'm not saying the Pete book saved the PI novel. I'm just saying that it came out in a time when all the publishers, all the agents, and all the other people I spoke to were like, no one's really doing PI novels anymore. That's like something of the past. But I really wanted to write a PI series because I was reading PI series and I wanted to add to that kind of mythos a little bit. And so the bigger thing is just, write what you're passionate about, because if you're just writing to a trend or writing to what the market tells you, it's going to show in the work. It's going to show that you're just really cranking on this to create something to sell, as opposed to this person's really passionate and you can see it in the pages. Which, look, there's always economic concerns in the business. Like, obviously we're writing to sell, we're writing to get readers, but the thing that's going to get you to the desk and get you excited about the work is you being excited about the idea. So
No, I should summarize Secret Identity for our listeners who haven't yet had a chance to read it. It's 1985, and we're following Carmen Valdez. I describe her as an aspiring comic writer now in New York City at a fairly dysfunctional comic book publishing house. Her ambitions are thwarted by emotional chaos of her own making and a murder she stumbles into. I found Carmen to be both sympathetic and maddening. Uh,
yeah,
uh, is
she's
that the
complicated.
yeah, is that what you were going for? Yeah, she's complicated. and which makes her a very rich character. That's the reaction you wanted.
I mean, I definitely didn't want her to feel. I wanted to put her in a situation that would reasonably pull a regular, quote unquote, regular person out of their routines and investigate a murder. Like it wasn't a situation where it was Pete who, something falls into his lap and he's like, okay, I will thrust myself into a dangerous situation because I'm like in recovery and not fully like aware of what I need to be doing. Like I'm willing to take these kind of risks because I'm a little foolhardy. She's a pretty regular person. Obviously, she has a job. She's got a strained relationship with her family. She's struggling to pay rent. She's just moved to New York. So, what's the thing that's going to pull her out of that to to kind of get the engine rolling. So
Right.
I wanted her to be complicated. I didn't want her to feel predictable. And she's got this cool like exterior, but what I found most interesting as I wrote her was that you'd see these cracks and then you'd start to get a sense of who was under there, like who she really was and how she really felt. And she's got to put up this shield to protect herself because she holds these things so close, whether it's her passion for comics, her issues with her dad, her past relationships. And that felt really like fertile to me and it felt really interesting. And it also felt like not monochrome, like not good guy, bad guy. It felt very complicated. And I really gravitate towards complicated characters that kind of dance in that gray area.
Well, I found the tone that you used to be just really perfect for the story.
Oh, good.
I mean, I felt that you were straddling the YA and adult forms, and it also has a bit of that sort of dark breeziness and circumstantial suspense and the cliffhangers that I find in the best crime comics. Did you labor to find that particular voice? Or is that
Um,
because I suspect, Alex, that somebody who writes the kind of comics that you do that I've read would naturally have that voice if you were setting a story in that world. But I might
did
be
I,
wrong.
I think what I didn't want to. I think sometimes when we write and we're writing something different and new, you can fall back into your previous stuff. Like I didn't want it to sound like a Pete novel set at a different time. So I knew that it was going to be a slower burn. Like it's a I don't want to say it's a slow novel. It's more of a simmering suspense. Like there's
Yep.
not a lot of action. There's not a lot of violence. I think a gun is fired twice in the book, one off screen, one on screen. Um, I wanted it to be much more like a Highsmith novel, and a lot of like personal character driven suspense. I wanted you to be in Carmen's head, but not in her head, and that's something I thought about a lot when writing Alter Ego, the sequel or follow up, because that one is in first person. You are in Annie's head, and I think that made it a big difference from Carmen, where you just want to know what she's thinking a lot of the time, not because she's acting erratically, but because she's hopefully to the reader interesting, and you want to kind of piece together what her idea is. Um, so yeah, it came naturally, I guess, but it's definitely something that I had to work at to maintain and
Mm.
not fall back into like writing a PI novel or writing something else.
Yeah. One character says to Carmen, comics are dying. The stuff these people produce now, just overwritten garbage. You can't make pulp into literature. Just be who you are and accept your place. It's even uglier in context. Um,
Yeah.
did you hear those kind of things? Not when you were writing comics, but when you were trying to expand your portfolio into becoming a novelist.
I think you hear variations of things, and then as a writer, you extrapolate and expand and turn up the volume. I mean, there was always I worked in publicity, I worked in marketing, so it was always the thought of like, well, just do that. Like you're already in the industry. Like why do you need to now want to why do you want to write now? And why do you're also going to write novels in addition to this full-time job that you're doing, or now you're going to write comics in addition to the novels and in addition to the day job. I think people and this goes back to what we said at the beginning. Like I think you always it's easier to pigeonhole someone and say this is what you are and this is what you do and just go off and keep doing that and I don't have to worry about it. But I think people are complicated, and I know I am. I know that sometimes I'm interested in different things and I want to do different things, and I think for Carmen, it was just such a primal need and desire to want to create these stories that, if anything, having people tell her that made her want to do it more.
Yeah. What you alluded to it a little bit, but I don't want to give anything away that you don't want to give away. But
Uh-huh.
what could you tell us about Alter Ego?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, Alter Ego comes out December 3rd from Flatiron, and it is the word I'd like to use is follow up. It's not a sequel per se, though it does pick up right at the end of the epilogue of Secret Identity, which is a flash forward. And I'll leave that at that without spoiling the end of Secret Identity, though the book's been out a couple of years. Alter Ego is set in the modern day, and the protagonist, Annie Bustamante, is a former comic book artist who has left the industry. She just felt set aside, and so she left comics and started pursuing a career as a filmmaker. And she's gotten some success. She's floundering a bit when we find her, and trying to figure out what her next project is after a disappointing experience with one of the big studios. Um, and she realizes that this entertainment company called Triumph Entertainment is launching, and they're going to relaunch this multimedia campaign featuring characters from this obscure comic book company called Triumph Comics. And it includes the Lynx, which to Annie is basically the gold standard. It's the comic that got her into comics. It's the comic she's been drawing on the side for fun. It's every comic reader has that one book that just feels like theirs.
Ah,
Obviously everyone knows Spider-Man or X-Men or Batman, but there's always like obscure characters that you just kind of say, this is mine, and I will follow them, and I feel a connection. And so, Annie thinks, well, I thought I was the only person that even knew this book existed. And so Triumph Entertainment reaches out to her and asks her to relaunch the series as a comic and to work in partnership with this very mysterious and controversial filmmaker to create this Lynx comic book, but also this Lynx media. And she feels like, okay, this is like sometimes your dream project falls into your lap, and this is what's going to bring me back into comics, this medium I loved. And um, maybe we'll also get to make a movie or a show out of it. And as she digs deeper into the history of the Lynx, and as she gets to know the backstory of this company that's funding or theoretically funding this new iteration of the Lynx, she realizes there's much more, and not a lot of it is good, and she finds herself caught up in a much more dangerous game. And then there are comic book sequences where you see Annie's work on the new Lynx comic book as she puts it together. And obviously, there's connective tissue with Secret Identity, but I will say that if you have not read Secret Identity and you just pick up Alter Ego, you'll understand everything completely. There's enough exposition to explain what happened before without
right.
bogging it down, but you will have a richer experience if you read them both together, or read them back to back, because there's some echoes there. It's really the other side of the coin. If Secret
Ah,
Identity was a look at a lost era of the comic book industry and a lost era of New York, like Alter Ego is very much, what is the industry like today? What is the push and pull of like art and commerce? And this, if Secret Identity, no one thought, okay, these comics are going to become movies and TV shows. Now we're in a time where every comic is thought of, well, how do we flip this? Like, do we make this a
right.
show? Can we make this a movie, a video game? And like, what are how many cooks are in the kitchen when you're trying to make a comic book? So it's a very different kind of book. It's a little bit more Hitchcockian, a little bit more of a thriller than a noir novel. Yeah, and I think I hope people enjoy it. It was definitely fun to write. It was definitely hard to write because I didn't set out to write Secret Identity with a sequel in mind, and then kind of midway or three-fourths in, I realized that there was a sequel in there, and it's like, how do you do something that's quote unquote a sequel but doesn't feel like a rerun? Like,
Right. Right.
so I think it's different enough that it feels like its own thing with echoes of what came before.
Yeah. Yeah. Listen, before you go, I
Yeah.
absolutely have to ask you about the Dick Tracy comic series
Oh,
you're
sure.
writing. Boy, when I found out that Dick Tracy was going to be revived in comic book form, I was very happy.
Oh, good.
I think I told you that I was at a comic book store the morning that they were unboxing it. Um, how did you become involved in that project?
It's a bit of a long and winding road. When I was at Archie, I've always been a Dick Tracy fan. I remember watching the film when it came out, and that was right after the Tim Burton Batman movie hit. And so I think, it wasn't like today where every month there's a new comic movie or a new comic TV show. That was like, it was gold when it showed up. I saw Batman, and then I saw Dick Tracy, and I was like, oh wow, this is like the next thing. And that drew me into the original source material, the Chester Gould strips, the Max Allan Collins strips. I remember Max did the novelization, which was really interesting. And anyway, so I was a fan for a long time, and I remember this is around 2015, so that kind of tells you how far back I was thinking about it. I remember wondering, like, who has the license to make comic books for Dick Tracy? So I reached out to Tribune, which is the company that owns the character, and I said, I work at Archie. We'd love to talk about maybe doing this as a comic book. And then that got rolling, and we announced the comic a few years later. And for whatever boring business reasons, it turned out we didn't have the license because of some error, and it went away. And so that was a huge bummer because we were so excited. I was going to co-write it with Mike Moreci, and we felt like it was such a missed opportunity for us as two like big Dick Tracy fans, and that could have been it, honestly. But then I left Archie, and I thought, well, I know these people, I know Tribune, and I know enough about the comic book business that if I were to me and my partners, if we were to get the license ourselves, we could probably find a publisher. And so that's really what we did. And we reached out to Tribune. The license was then available, and we sent them our pitch, and they said, yeah, we're fine, like deputizing you to find a publisher for this. And yeah, and so it's not a non-traditional route, because usually it's the publisher who gets the license, and then they say, well, we want these creatives to do it. And so it was the inverse, whereas we would go to the publisher and say, hey, we have the rights to Dick Tracy. Do you guys want to make a comic? And the Mad Cave, this publisher based in Miami, who's done some great things, were very keen on it. And that's how it came to be. And we got this great artist, Geraldo Borges, who has a fantastic, very dark noir style. And we really wanted to just tell a version of the story that honors what came before the Chester Gould material, which is very pulpy and very dark and very gruesome, but give it a sheen of like film noir, like have it feel more like LA Confidential meets Dick Tracy without negating anything else. Like it's I think the end result is a nice blend of the movie, like the color palette of the movie, a little muted, the Gould stuff, and then kind of a neo-noir vibe, which is what we want, like what we were interested in telling. And so the response has been good. I'm happy with it. It seems like we have some runway to tell the story, which is rare in comics these days. So I'm excited.
Well, Alex, this has been great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you
so much for taking so much time and joining us on Writers at Work.
Thanks for having me.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersatworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.